Chapter 38. Did we run out of chili sauce at home? Eloise walked into the kitchen in her slippers, handing the chili sauce to Leonardo before leaning against the refrigerator, arms crossed, watching the man in front of her. She then shifted her gaze to the trash can at his feet. A bottle of empty chili sauce lay in the trash can, apparently used up. The man was now back to Eloise, so she couldn't see his expression. Eloise didn't have many doubts, just didn't expect that the chili sauce would be used up so quickly. It was her first time doing this kind of thing. She heard that ordinary children often helped their parents buy chili sauce at the supermarket when they were young, but she had never experienced such a childhood. Her parents hardly ever cooked, and there was no need to, with servants and chefs at home. So, buying chili sauce had never fallen on her. Recalling the scene earlier, she stood in front of the shelves, looking at the rows of bottles and cans, and felt a bit overwhelmed. Although Leonardo had sent her a photo, the chili sauces on the shelf all seemed to look quite similar, causing her some trouble in the supermarket. "It'll be ready in 10 minutes, the man said, and then, as if he thought of something, he added, "I bought you makeup remover. It's in the bathroom." Eloise raised an eyebrow, seemingly finding his purchase of makeup remover a bit novel. With a slight smile, she walked towards the man, standing slightly shorter than Leonardo without her high heels, but that didn't stop her from teasing him. Her finger gently touched the man's back, then slowly slid down along the indentation of the spine. As expected, the man tensed up, and even the spatula in his hand came to a halt in midair. "Why did you think of buying me makeup remover?" Eloise asked, her fingertip finally landing on the man's black belt, giving it a light tug. Such bold behavior was undoubtedly teasing, her action full of seduction, but not vulgar, causing Leonardo to feel a jolt. His ears turned red instantly, his face darkened, and his lips pressed tightly together, unsure whether to let go of the pot handle in his left hand or the spatula in his right. Did she forget that he was still a man? Who gave her the courage to tug a man's pants? Did she even know what that meant? "I noticed you went straight to remove your makeup when I came to your apartment before, so I bought a bottle to keep here," Leonardo quickly explained, his tone suddenly changing as he coldly said, "Eloise, let go." Knowing when to stop, Eloise pouted, unsure whether to say her little boyfriend was too considerate or too innocent. He even thought of the makeup remover, but why didn't he think of staying the night? He bought makeup remover, why not also pick up some condoms? With a flick of her finger, the belt slapped against the man's belt, causing Leonardo's face to darken even more. The woman turned and left the kitchen, but just before she left, she suddenly smelled a faint ester fragrance, which was soon overwhelmed by the rich aroma of dishes, disappearing without a trace. When Eloise came out of the kitchen after removing her makeup, her diligent little boyfriend had already served the meal on the table. Her face was fresh and clean, and her mood was also happier. She didn't dislike makeup, and in the workplace, makeup was a necessary skill. But after all, there was a layer of something on her skin, and even the most prestigious makeup would feel uncomfortable after staying on her face for 8 or 9 hours. That's why Eloise usually removed her makeup as soon as she returned to her apartment. But she didn't expect that Leonardo's thoughts were so meticulous that he even noticed this detail. After the meal as usual, Eloise sat on the sofa to rest, while Leonardo was still cleaning up in the kitchen. At that moment, the doorbell suddenly rang, and Eloise felt puzzled, looking at the still busy Leonardo, and then stood up from the sofa, heading towards the entrance. The person knocking on the door was a middle-aged woman with a kind face, not looking like a bad person. Eloise opened the door, her face wearing a polite smile, and asked, "May I ask who you are?" The other party seemed not to expect that the one opening the door would be a woman, stunned for a moment before looking up at the apartment number on the door. Next, Leonardo, who had finished cleaning up, also came out of the kitchen, and the middle-aged woman, seeing the man behind Eloise, understood everything. "Young man, why was there a noisy crowd at your door an hour ago? I think I even saw them hitting someone, talking about chopping off hands." As soon as the middle-aged woman finished speaking, Eloise's face darkened, and the man behind Eloise also subconsciously frowned, his eyes flashing with impatience, as if he didn't expect someone to meddle in his business. However, the middle-aged woman was a kind person, having lived half her life with a simple mind. She didn't notice Leonardo's annoyance, her face full of concern, her tone filled with worry. "Are you all right? Did you get into some trouble? Do you need help calling the police?" Eloise came back to her senses, and as she turned her head, the man's eyes faded, his lips pressed tightly, and his face slightly pale. Her eyebrows knitted. Eloise resisted the impulse to interrogate him on the spot, turned to the middle-aged woman at the door, and said, "I'm sorry for the trouble. We will handle this matter well, and will definitely not disturb you again." "Oh, what are you saying? We're all neighbors, of course. We should help each other when there's a problem." The middle-aged woman was startled by Eloise's politeness, her face flushed, feeling a bit restrained. She didn't expect that the young man who rented the apartment, who usually seemed quiet, would find such an elegant girlfriend, not only good-looking but also graceful, feeling like a lady from a prestigious family. "You're too kind. It's our fault this time, and we'll be counting on you for the days to come," Eloise said, her smile becoming even warmer. The two exchanged pleasantries, and the middle-aged woman finally turned to leave. However, the moment the door closed, the atmosphere in the apartment suddenly changed, and Eloise's smile disappeared, her face quite dark. Throughout, Leonardo didn't say a word. Even the interaction with the neighbor was handled by Eloise. The man now slightly bowed his head, looking like a submissive figure, but it only made Eloise more furious. The two stood at the door for 2 minutes, and finally, Eloise broke the silence and walked towards the living room. Clearly, the woman's mood was extremely unpleasant. Leonardo still stood at the entrance, not daring to move, his tall and slender figure in the narrow passageway, looking rather lonely and miserable. However, hidden under his bangs, his gaze carried a cold light, mixed with a hint of hostility, as if annoyed by the meddling of the older sister earlier. Originally, he had planned to send Eloise away in advance to avoid her knowing about this incident, but he didn't expect a neighbor to jump out halfway, causing him to inadvertently reveal his flaws in front of Eloise. His mind raced, thinking about how to explain the incident mentioned by the older sister. But at that moment, Eloise, standing in the center of the living room, suddenly asked coldly, "Did your uncle come to see you?" Leonardo, standing still, was slightly taken aback, and after a few seconds, he quickly realized and responded with an "mm-hmm." The man's eyes were complicated, but it wasn't hard to understand why Eloise would guess this. His past was already exposed in front of the woman, and Miriam's incident was handled by her, so it was no surprise that she could find out about Miriam, but not Logan. However, Eloise's tone suggested that she was previously unaware of this. Whether Eloise had a hand in the $5 million debt, he wasn't clear. After all, Logan had always been fond of gambling, and when the gambling addiction hit, he couldn't control himself. His parents' liquidated estate was close to $2 million, all of which were later used by Logan to pay off his gambling debts, so it wasn't surprising that he owed $5 million this time. "Come here first," Eloise said, her tone filled with a bit of helplessness. As soon as her words fell, Leonardo finally moved and walked towards Eloise. Eloise looked at the man before her, his pitiful appearance like a little boyfriend scolded by his owner, ears drooping, making her wonder if her attitude was too harsh just now. "When did he contact you?" The man's gaze flickered, and then he replied softly, "He called me this afternoon." I didn't answer, and then he came to the apartment again in the evening. "Why did he come looking for you?" Eloise asked, her heart already having an answer. "He wants me to sign something," Leonardo said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "He owes $500,000 to someone and wants to sell the house he's living in to pay off the debt, but that house was left to me by my parents, and I don't want to." Eloise's expression grew more solemn as she noticed his fists, veins bulging with tension. Her lips parted slightly, about to speak, but the man in front of her pulled her into a tight embrace. With his arms firmly around her slender shoulders, Leonardo buried his head in the crook of her neck, trembling as if in extreme distress. Eloise was momentarily startled, then gently wrapped her arms around him, feeling his pain and anxiety. What else did he say? Eloise placed her hand on his back, stroking it repeatedly in an attempt to soothe his emotions. His body gradually relaxed, his grip on Eloise tightening as he nuzzled his face against her neck. However, the eyes peeking from her hair were startlingly bright, devoid of any sorrow, deep and empty, filled only with indifference. Leonardo didn't respond, but Eloise sensed that things weren't as simple as they seemed. $500,000 was a significant sum for an ordinary person. From what the neighbors said, Logan had brought a group of people to cause a ruckus, likely because Leonardo had initially refused his request over the phone, prompting a face-to-face confrontation. Did he threaten you? At this, Leonardo seemed to recall a frightening memory, shuddering and stiffening noticeably. Eloise felt his unease and anger flared within her, her eyes flashing with intense hostility. No, he denied outright, though his body betrayed a different truth. Between words and actions, Eloise chose to trust the honesty of his physical response. Originally, Eloise had only intended to teach Logan a lesson, but now she felt she had been too lenient, allowing him the chance to bother Leonardo. "Do you think I'm cruel?" the man suddenly asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. "Cruel for what?" "For not helping my uncle repay his debt, for not signing the mortgage contract for the house." Hearing this, Eloise couldn't help but interrupt. "The house is yours. You have the right to handle it as you see fit. Moreover, you aren't obligated to cover someone else's mistakes." Hidden beneath her hair, the man's lips curled into a cold, callous expression as he spoke words that were heartbreaking. "I wasn't at the apartment when it happened. I didn't know those people would hurt him, nor did I expect he'd be driven to this point." As Leonardo spoke, each word made Eloise's expression darker. "When he called me, I was terrified. If I had known—" "Don't dwell on it," Eloise cut in coldly, interrupting him directly. "If he bothers you again, just call me." Her words were like a calming pill. Feeling the softness of her hair against his lips, inhaling her familiar perfume, Leonardo's brows were touched with a rare joy. "Why don't you go take a shower?" Eloise suggested, and Leonardo finally let her go. Everything seemed to return to normal, unaffected by this unexpected incident. 10 minutes later, Leonardo was in the bathroom showering, while Eloise stood on the balcony, gazing at the night scene, her expression inscrutable. The cool night breeze helped Eloise calm down. After an unknown period, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Within 5 seconds, the call was answered, and Luke's voice came through. "Eloise." "Luke, you've gone too far with Logan." Luke was momentarily stunned, unable to immediately grasp what Eloise meant. The tenfold idea had originally come from her, and Logan did indeed owe $5 million in gambling debts, driven to a corner. Yet she suddenly said it was too much? Wasn't this the outcome she wanted? "Eloise, are you referring to?" Eloise's gaze darkened, her tone exceptionally cold. "You pushed too hard," disturbing Leonardo. "Luke." "So, Eloise, do you mean to ease up a bit?" Luke silently complained to himself, thinking that perhaps Eloise's rare compassion had kicked in, only to find it was still about Leonardo. "No," Eloise said, pulling out a cigarette with one hand from her pocket, biting it between her lips, and lighting it with a lighter. A puff of white smoke obscured her expression, yet her words were chilling. No need to slow down. "I don't want him in Leonardo's sight again." She took another drag, the orange glow of the cigarette bright against the dark night. "File a lawsuit for fraud. With $5 million, that should be enough for him to spend a decade or two in prison." Her tone was so light, almost judicial, as if pronouncing a death sentence. As the call ended, Luke couldn't help but shiver, feeling his boss's terror index rising daily. On the other end, Eloise returned her phone to her pocket, smoking while reflecting on the recent events and the man's words. Now she realized Leonardo's request for chili sauce was probably just a pretext to distract her, an attempt to keep her from knowing about Logan. But would Logan, having not achieved his goal, have left so easily? Eloise frowned, sensing something amiss, but this slight anomaly was like smoke in the air, dissipating the moment she tried to grasp it. After finishing her cigarette, Leonardo emerged from the bathroom, drying his wet hair and heading toward the balcony in his slippers. Unlike his reserved demeanor during the day, nighttime Leonardo seemed to shed a layer of restraint, clinging affectionately and sometimes showing possessive tendencies. Like now. He wrapped Eloise tightly in his arms from behind, still damp from his shower, the scent of his shower gel mingling with the lingering smell of tobacco on the balcony, creating an unusual harmony. "You've been smoking again?" Leonardo frowned, detecting the familiar smell, his tone somewhat reprimanding. "Just one," Eloise replied, struggling slightly against her boyfriend's pretend seriousness. Leonardo seemed about to say more, but Eloise quickly diverted the topic. "When you returned to the apartment, had those people left?" He was momentarily taken aback, his gaze darkening as he replied faintly, "Yeah. Did you make them leave?" Leonardo tightened his embrace, his impassive face and indifferent tone colder than the night breeze. "I said I'd called the police. By the time I got to the apartment, there was no one at the door." Eloise narrowed her eyes. "Is that so?" A week later, Eloise was working in her office when her phone suddenly rang, breaking the silence. Seeing it was a call from Jim, Eloise hesitated for half a minute before answering. As soon as the call connected, Jim spoke with rare seriousness and urgency. "Leonardo's family came to the company causing a scene. They're quite agitated and even slapped Leonardo." At this news, Eloise's grip on the phone tightened, her expression darkening instantly. Chapter 39. When Eloise arrived at Align Corporation, the lobby on the first floor was already crowded with people, and she immediately spotted Leonardo standing in the center of the crowd. The anger that had built up on her way here surged to an unprecedented level. In the noisy lobby, the man stood silently, his head slightly lowered, his disheveled hair covering his eyes, making it impossible to see his expression. An old man stood in front of him, wailing and cursing Leonardo, spewing all sorts of obscene words. Whenever someone tried to defend Leonardo, the old man's anger intensified, his curses becoming fiercer, also dragging the interveners into his tirade. Gradually, no one dared to speak up. A very realistic scene unfolded before Eloise, and the man seemed accustomed to it, standing there with a steady, thin body, quiet to the point of being heart-wrenching. Eloise knew that keeping oneself out of trouble was human nature, but when it involved Leonardo, her anger burned like a raging fire, consuming her reason. As the old man lunged forward again, intending to hit, Eloise couldn't hold back any longer. She quickly pushed through the people in front of her, her face cold. The next moment, a gasp echoed through the now silent lobby. Even the man caught in his own world suddenly looked up. "Who are you?" The old man's wrist was firmly grasped by Eloise, who seemed surprised that someone had jumped out to protect Leonardo. With a flash of ruthlessness in her eyes, Eloise looked at the old man with unmistakable coldness and disgust. Carter met the woman's gaze, startled, and was frozen in place, only to realize moments later that he had been intimidated by a young girl. Embarrassed, he was about to start cursing when Eloise suddenly intervened, forcefully breaking free from Carter's grip. The old man, unsteady on his feet, stumbled and fell to the ground as a result. Everyone watched in stunned silence as the once bustling lobby fell into a dead quiet. The pain in his buttocks brought Logan back to his senses. "Get out!" Eloise's cold voice echoed through the lobby, sending shivers down everyone's spines. Standing over Carter, who was sitting on the ground, her cold, disdainful gaze made him feel like a piece of filth. Carter, having lived so long, had never been so humiliated. His face darkened, and after a few seconds, he pointed at Eloise, wailing, "She hit me. This woman hit me. My bum, oh my bum. You all saw it, she pushed me. I'm an old man, half in the grave, and she still dares to push me. Where's your conscience? Carter's antics were laughable to the onlookers, who began to speak up. Why are you being so unreasonable, old man? It was you who tried to hit someone first. Exactly, this is our company, not a place for you to throw a tantrum. I've never seen such a person, exploiting one's age and then accusing Eloise of lacking conscience. What a blatant reversal of truth. The situation suddenly turned. Carter hadn't expected that these people, initially indifferent, would jump in as soon as this woman appeared. Eloise frowned, ignoring Carter and the commotion around her. She turned to look at Leonardo behind her, forcibly lifting his chin to make him look up. The sight of his swollen cheek and bruised lip sparked her fury, pushing her beyond the bounds of reason. Her eyes flashed with a murderous intent. Hey, you people judge, this lad enjoys his wealth while ignoring his uncle's plight. How heartless. When his parents passed away, it was me, this old man, who raised him with great hardship. As a child, his uncle treated him like his own son, providing everything good for him. Now he's successful, and when his uncle is in trouble, he just turns his back on me. Eloise's brow twitched, and she couldn't help but laugh at the old man's twisted version of the truth. A cold, intimidating laugh that froze the atmosphere. Leonardo seemed to know what she was about to do, grabbing her slender wrist and whispering, "Eloise, let it go." Let it go? She wouldn't let anyone else mistreat him. Eloise nonchalantly shook off Leonardo's hand and walked over to Carter, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the tiles, striking fear into everyone's hearts. In front of everyone's eyes, Eloise stopped by Carter's feet, and in slow motion, everyone watched as she kicked Carter's leg. A scream pierced the air, shaking everyone. Ah, you witch. You dared to kick me. Murder. I'm calling the police. Carter, sitting on the ground, clutched his leg, howling as if his leg had been run over, a pitiful sight. The shrill sound deepened the chill in Eloise's eyes. She spoke, and Carter, as if possessed, fell silent. Suffering hardship? How, with a few million in alimony, do you talk about suffering hardship to me? Eloise's lips curved slightly, each word cold. Not returning 2 slaps is my last shred of decency. Respecting your age, how can you be so shameless? At this point, Eloise crouched down, her smile broader, but her eyes devoid of warmth, more like a demon from hell. If you dare to bother Leonardo again, it won't just be a kick next time. Perhaps one day, your leg might just disappear. Such threats made Carter shiver as if marked by death, frozen in place. Eloise's kick, though not light, paled in comparison to the fear in his heart. Carter felt the fear of death for the first time. His turbid eyes trembled, and his once fierce demeanor was extinguished. His pale face was a satisfying sight to the onlookers. Half a minute later, Eloise stood up, scanning the surroundings. Does anyone have cash? Within 10 seconds, an employee who had been watching pushed through the crowd, handing his wallet to Eloise, panting, "Eloise, I have some." Eloise took out $400 and returned the wallet. "Thanks, I'll transfer you later." The employee took his wallet, blushing slightly. Next, Eloise looked down at Carter, her eyes cold, throwing the $400 at him. "Medical fee. Practice your acting before you try to extort again." With that, Eloise snapped her fingers, and the security guards promptly pulled Logan, who was lying on the floor, out of the lobby, clearing the space. Initially, when Carter started causing trouble, he relied on his age to be brazen. These days, even parking could attract people trying to fake being hit, so no one dared to intervene physically, limited to verbal insults. Worried about being falsely accused of causing injury, the security guards had tried to shoo him away, but Carter was shameless, fainting whenever approached, playing the consummate scoundrel. Most importantly, the old man was Leonardo the assistant's grandfather, and without Leonardo's order to remove him, they didn't dare act. Who knew what tangled family drama was involved? No one expected Eloise to intervene so boldly, directly kicking him, her demeanor even more arrogant than the old man's, fearless of getting into trouble, leaving the onlookers stunned. feeling a rush of excitement. Seeing Carter dragged out the door, Eloise was about to transfer the money when Leonardo stepped between them, coldly telling the employee, "I'll transfer you the 400. Eloise, raising an eyebrow, observed as Leonardo transferred funds, not intervening, standing there with her arms crossed. By then, Jim had also rushed down from a meeting, and seeing his own CEO approach, the employees dispersed, leaving just Eloise, Leonardo, and Jim in the now empty lobby. "You all right?" Jim looked at Leonardo, his gaze lingering on his bruised face, his expression colder. During the senior meeting, Leonardo received a call about his grandpa causing trouble downstairs, insisting on seeing him. Jim hadn't thought much, letting Leonardo handle it first, only learning later that Leonardo had been attacked, so he called Eloise. Meeting just ended, he rushed down, surprised by Eloise's quick action. "Leonardo, go home and rest today." Jim spoke, his heart also somewhat uneasy. After all, the Leonardo the assistant in front of him was Eloise's favorite, and she hadn't even settled the matter when he snatched Leonardo to be his assistant. As a result, he was bullied in his company, and judging by Eloise's temper, she would definitely demand an explanation. "It's not necessary," Leonardo said, his expression unusually cold, much the same as usual, as if the slap had never landed on his face. Eloise glanced at her watch. There was less than an hour left until the end of the workday. So she spoke up, "Let's go upstairs first." In the executive lounge, Eloise leaned against the windowsill, her expression stern, eyebrows slightly furrowed, emanating a chill from every inch of her body. In the confined space, the atmosphere was slightly tense, while Jim stood not far away, his expression also becoming somewhat solemn. His gaze fell on the cigarette held between Eloise's fingers, and Jim's thoughts surged, but he didn't know how to broach the subject. He knew about Eloise's smoking, he'd known since long ago. Eloise's personality was wild. She broke free from all constraints after coming of age, doing everything from smoking and drinking to racing and dating. Jim had never tried to dissuade her because he knew Eloise was extremely self-disciplined, with a good sense of proportion, and didn't need interference from outsiders. However, Jim felt that recently Eloise seemed to be teetering on the edge of losing control, much like now. The cigarette was Jim's. Eloise hadn't brought one, so she asked Jim for a smoke. "What do you plan to do about Leonardo's situation?" Jim spoke, his words carrying a hint of concern as a friend. "It's not a big deal," Eloise said, flicking ash into the ashtray on the windowsill. It really wasn't a big deal for her. Today was an accident. Eloise underestimated the shamelessness of that family. But such people are usually afraid of death. A little threat should do the trick, and if not, a bit of manipulation will likely deter them from making further trouble. Thinking of this, Eloise looked at Jim with a colder gaze. "You're quite capable. My man got slapped under your watch. How do we settle this account?" Jim slightly raised an eyebrow, as if expecting her to say so, hence he merely shrugged and said, "I was in a meeting at the time. As the CEO of the company, could I really abandon an executive meeting just to protect your little boyfriend? Besides, I only found out about him being slapped later. Didn't I call you as soon as possible?" Hearing his explanation, the hostility between Eloise's brows deepened. Although she understood that it wasn't realistic for Jim to interrupt a meeting to protect Leonardo, given his position, she could also comprehend. But her little boyfriend had been slapped, and she couldn't let go of this anger. A cigarette burnt down to the end, and Eloise's frustration only slightly eased. But then, Jim suddenly spoke up again. "I heard your parents arranged an assistant for you?" Eloise met Jim's slightly teasing gaze, responding indifferently with an N. "How come? You don't have any thoughts about it?" "What thoughts could I have? Their intentions, could I possibly not know?" Jim observed Eloise's expression, seeing that she indeed had no interest in the newly arrived assistant. "So what are you going to do about it?" "Your mother is also quite eager, and when I said you had someone you liked, she didn't seem to believe me very much," Jim said, his tone containing a hint of probing. "To be honest, you might as well just bring Leonardo home. I think your parents are not the old-fashioned type, probably won't oppose your relationship. Eloise fell silent for a few seconds, her gaze becoming deep, and after a while, she slowly spoke. We'll see. His situation is quite special. I don't want to pressure him too much. We're still young. I can spend a few more years with him. You might think you're young, but your parents want you to get married early. Jim said, his smile suddenly taking on a profound meaning. You're not doing well. It's been so long and you still haven't settled it. That's not like your style. Eloise directly rolled her eyes at him, her disdain apparent. What I'm saying is, since the slow cooking method doesn't work, why don't you go for something more intense? Hearing this, Eloise was just about to retort when she seemed to think of something, her gaze suddenly turning dark, and she didn't refute Jim's words. Before 6 o'clock, Eloise walked out of the lounge and headed straight towards Leonardo's desk. Seeing the man pretending to tidy up his documents with his head down, Eloise's index finger slightly bent, tapping lightly on the desktop twice, and then spoke up, ready. Leonardo looked up, meeting the woman's gaze, then glanced at Jim, who had just walked out of the lounge, his eyes turning cold, responding lightly with an N. Then let's go, Eloise said, immediately walking towards the elevator. After a slight pause, the man quickly stood up from his chair and followed behind Eloise. In the gaze of everyone in the executive office, the two left the office one after the other, leaving a group of dumbfounded staff behind. Seeing the scene, Jim couldn't help but smile, then clapped his hands, breaking the shock of the crowd, saying, "All right, you should probably start packing up to go home." A few seconds later, the atmosphere exploded like a pot, with everyone asking what was going on. However, even though their CEO didn't explain, the enigmatic smile on his face confirmed their suspicions. Leonardo, the assistant, and Eloise were actually a couple. Underground parking lot, the confined car interior was as quiet as stagnant water. The atmosphere became somewhat strange, and both of them sat silently in their seats, neither showing any intention to speak. After an unknown period, the woman in the driver's seat suddenly spoke up, "Leonardo." Almost instinctively, Leonardo turned his head, and at the same time, the woman quickly reached out and grabbed the man's tie, pulling him towards her. Before Leonardo could react, her hand landed on his cheek, her thumb gently stroking the injured corner of his mouth, with a hard-to-suppress pain. "Buy some medicine to apply later," said Eloise. The man covered the woman's hand with his own, his gaze lowered, eyelashes quivering slightly, his voice light. "It's fine. It'll heal in a couple of days." "TSK, but I like your face. If you get disfigured, what will you use to seduce me?" The woman said, her tone playful. The flirtatiousness in the car instantly ignited. Leonardo tightened his grip on the woman's hand as his lips pressed together, about to speak when the tie around his neck suddenly tightened. The next moment, the cold lips felt a softness. The man's pupils contracted, and before he could react, the other's attack instantly changed, invading the city with extreme aggression, sweeping through everything. The tip of her tongue slid over his teeth, and Leonardo was unable to dodge, forced to engage with her. The temperature on his face gradually rose, the sound of his heartbeat became clearer, and the rhythm of the man's breathing was completely disrupted, becoming somewhat rapid. At the same time, between the two's lips, there was the sound of wetness that made one's face red. Leonardo had been taught before, and after several personal lessons from Eloise, his kissing skills had improved significantly. However, at this moment, the man was still defeated due to lack of experience, allowing the woman to do as she pleased, eating him up inside and out. Perhaps because it was too intense, the man suddenly felt a sharp pain in the injury on his cheek, and Leonardo couldn't help but inhale sharply, his body trembling slightly. Eloise seemed to sense this, her actions immediately becoming much gentler, and after parting, she gently licked the corner of the man's lips, causing Leonardo to tremble again. The car interior suddenly became much hotter, the man's cheeks flushed red, looking at the woman with eyes slightly bright, still wet. Seeing her little boyfriend's adorable expression, Eloise's previous irritation dissipated a lot. Wiping the moisture from his lips, the woman slightly raised an eyebrow, her voice hoarser. "Pack up the things in the apartment. We're moving to my place later." Leonardo was still stunned, and after a few seconds of hearing Eloise's words, he suddenly came to his senses, asking, "Move to your place?" Eloise said, her expression serious. "What if someone comes looking for you at the apartment again? It's not safe there. Moving here can save some rent. Isn't that good? The guest room is already clean. Just bring your clothes over later," Eloise said, retracting her hand, smoothing out his messy collar bit by bit, and then returned to the driver's seat, speaking naturally, as if she hadn't realized what her words meant. The woman's tone was so serious, the reason so compelling, that he didn't know how to refuse. "I still have a rental contract signed," Leonardo said, averting his gaze. "It's fine, just void it." The man was stunned for a second, then seemed to suddenly realize something, looking at Eloise with a hint of shock. "What do you mean?" The woman's lips curved, and then she deftly fastened her seatbelt and started the car, turning the steering wheel. The next moment, the woman's words fell into Leonardo's ears along with the sound of the car engine. "Have you ever heard of the saying, keeping a lover in a golden house, Chapter 40. In the apartment room, Eloise leaned against the doorframe, watching Leonardo pack his luggage with a permanent smile on her face. The man seemed to be in a childish sulk, his face dark from start to finish, and even his packing was done with excessive force, accompanied by occasional small noises, exuding an aura of, "I am very angry right now." Eloise knew exactly what he was upset about. He felt duped, annoyed at his own stupidity and her slyness. However, Eloise didn't take Leonardo's tantrum to heart. After all, in a way, this was just a playful aspect of their relationship, not to be taken seriously. "I'm going to make a phone call. You finish packing and come out," Eloise said, turning and leaving the room. Leonardo paused in his packing, recalling the scene from a few months ago when they had come to view the apartment together. Back then, he had thought he was getting a good deal, only to realize in the end, it was all because of Eloise. His gaze deepened, and the remaining traces of embarrassment and anger on his face gradually faded. With a dark glint in his eyes, he tightened his grip on the clothes, revealing a kind of obsession he hadn't even realized he possessed. Yes, the greatest fortune he had ever encountered was Eloise. He could do without anything else, but he needed her, only her. Meanwhile, Eloise was in the living room calling Luke, briefing him on the remaining work. She had left her company duties behind after receiving Jim's call and rushed to Align Corporation, something she had never done in over 2 years of working there. She admitted it wasn't the most responsible act for a company president, but in that situation, emotion had trumped reason. Fortunately, now there was a vice president. Most of the work fell on Ronnie's shoulders, leaving her with less to do. About 10 minutes later, Eloise had just hung up the phone when her wrist holding the phone suddenly tightened. Before she could react, she was pulled around and pressed against the balcony door. Her hand holding the phone was pinned above her head. Looking up at the man in front of her, any surprise she felt quickly dissipated. She met his gaze with interest, showing no discomfort from her passive position. Still, she remained composed. "What's up?" Eloise raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on her lips. Despite being pinned down, she exuded dominance. The man's expression remained cold, his hair slightly disheveled over his forehead, his gaze intense, and combined with the injuries on his cheek and mouth, he looked somewhat ruggedly handsome. Eloise's smile deepened, her gaze on Leonardo now also tinged with anticipation. The man leaned closer, their noses brushing, the familiar cold scent of his now with an edge of aggression. "Bought specially for me?" A seemingly random question, but Eloise immediately understood, chuckling and countering, "What do you think?" It wasn't hard to guess. Given Eloise's status, she had numerous properties. There was no need for her to buy property here. To put it bluntly, these houses didn't meet her standards. "Been coveting me for a long time?" The man narrowed his eyes, his voice deliberately lowered, sounding magnetic. "You knew that already." Eloise lifted her chin, their eyes locking, the atmosphere around them igniting. Her back stiffened, the muscles under her shirt becoming more defined, like a beast ready for battle, blood pumping. Though he was the one being hunted, the dynamics between them had subtly shifted without notice. In this game of predator and prey, it was unclear who held the upper hand. The man lowered his head, driven by emotion to kiss her, but Eloise turned her head slightly, avoiding his move. "It's getting late, we still need to go to the supermarket." Eloise wasn't averse to Leonardo's initiative. On the contrary, she liked it. However, this timing wasn't suitable for intimacy. Once they returned to the apartment, there would be plenty of time and energy to explore each other. Leonardo seemed surprised that Eloise had refused. His lips, missing their mark, landed on her ear. His gaze darkened, but he didn't give up, instead blowing gently into her ear and murmuring, "Honey, don't you want to check my homework? I studied really hard." Eloise's gaze paused, then intensified, recalling their recent entanglement in the car, her throat tightening. Entranced or driven by genuine desire, they began a performance evaluation against the glass door. Leonardo was indeed clever, mastering techniques after just one experience, applying them adeptly, even improving on them. Eloise had kissed others before, of various styles, gentle, intense, awkward. But never like now, completely stirring her most primal urges. Wanting to devour him entirely, to sink with him, until death do them part. After an unknown time, Leonardo released her lips. Their foreheads touching, they breathed heavily, both flushed, seeing the unusual emotion in each other's eyes. "How was it?" he asked, his voice husky with desire. Eloise chuckled, then rewarded him with a peck on the lips, saying, "Not bad, keep it up." In the parking lot, the woman sat in the driver's seat, touching up her lipstick in the rearview mirror. The kiss had been too intense, her lipstick nearly all gone. Leonardo sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the woman beside him, her cheeks flushed, her lips slightly swollen. The surging emotions in his eyes, the growing obsession, made him feel extremely excited. His fingertips trembled, reliving the recent kiss. Leonardo was exhilarated, feeling his most primal desires awakening, watching himself grow increasingly wild. He had anticipated Carter causing trouble, so he wasn't surprised when the news came in the afternoon. But Eloise's appearance was unforeseen. Carter had always been selfish, that dirty, opportunistic nature making him completely unaware of dignity. When his son was in trouble, he always came to him first, squeezing out every drop of blood. It had always been like this, and this time would be no different. Clearly, it was Logan who told him about his job at Align Corporation, and Carter's actions were exactly as he expected, including the endless insults and the hard slap. He didn't dodge, as there were many onlookers. Compared to a seemingly helpless old man, he needed to appear even more pathetic. Weak people garner sympathy. One was a young, strong man, the other a 70 or 80-year-old elder. The situation was unfavorable for him. He aimed to guide the onlookers' emotions, appearing more pitiful to gain an advantage. He had no plans to leave Align Corporation yet, so he wouldn't let Carter succeed. Eloise's arrival disrupted his plan, unexpectedly revealing his long-held struggles to everyone. Once someone else made the choice for him, the initial dissipated. She was his. From that moment on, he could declare to everyone, she was his. With a click, Eloise fastened her seatbelt after finishing her lipstick, driving towards the supermarket. It was getting late, and they had spent quite some time in the apartment, checking homework, so they quickly ate out and then headed to the supermarket. Since they were moving in together, it was different from just staying over. There was much to prepare. Leonardo pushed the shopping cart behind Eloise, glancing at the rows of toiletries on the shelves, recalling the night he had stayed at Eloise's apartment. Everything was impeccably clean, fully equipped, truly like a high-end hotel. However, it was precisely because things were too complete that suspicion arose, and half-used toiletries were evidence that someone had stayed there before. Eloise's romantic history was rich, and that night she had taken him in from the streets, but that didn't mean it was her first time. Perhaps before him, she had also brought other boyfriends back to the apartment, offering warmth to various men in need. "Has someone stayed in the guest room before?" the man asked casually, as if just mentioning it. Of course, Eloise replied without hiding anything. There was a boyfriend before, chased by a stalker to the apartment, so he hid here for a while. Leonardo seemed caught off guard by Eloise's frankness, standing still. Not seeing Leonardo follow, Eloise stopped, meeting his dark eyes, and couldn't help but laugh, jealous. The man's mouth tightened, feeling irritated by Eloise's nonchalant attitude. He knew those ex-boyfriends meant nothing to her, just past episodes. He should think the same, but the unease in his heart indicated he wasn't as magnanimous as he thought. She had liked too many before, and he couldn't guarantee he was the most special one from the start. Leonardo didn't speak, a subtle unease gradually creeping up. "I don't want to lie to you," Eloise approached Leonardo, saying, "I can tell you this openly because I know he's insignificant to me, but you're different. I don't want to lie to you." Upon hearing this, the man's eyes flickered, the coldness on his face lessened, but he still looked tense, unwilling to admit how quickly he had given in. "But that room will be exclusively yours from now on, only you." Gripping the shopping cart, the man paused, then said indifferently, "That bedsheet is ugly. I want to change it." Eloise was slightly taken aback, then laughed. "Sure, whatever you want. And that shower gel and shampoo, the scent is unpleasant. We'll change those too." At 8:30 p.m., Eloise was in the study, holding a video conference. Some company executives were abroad on business, and due to the time difference, the meeting was shifted to the evening. Half an hour later, the meeting finally ended, other high-level officials disconnecting, leaving only Ronnie and Eloise. Eloise had just removed her glasses and was about to end the video call when Ronnie on the other end of the line suddenly spoke up. "Do you have time to have a meal together? Your mother said we should have a proper talk." Her hand hovering in midair paused for a moment before withdrawing back to her side. Meeting Ronnie's gentle smile on the screen, her tone was extremely calm as she replied, "Let's talk directly now." Seeing Eloise's attitude, Ronnie couldn't help but chuckle, his tone carrying a hint of defeat when he spoke again. "You should be able to guess Mrs. Chen's intentions. She wants us to get to know each other. Can't you give me a chance? I believe you can see that I have feelings for you. And I think we are very suitable for each other. Mrs. Chen must also think so, otherwise she wouldn't have wanted to pair us up." Eloise slightly raised her eyebrows, a confident smile on her lips, showing no signs of shyness at Ronnie's subtle confession. "Ronnie, I admit that I appreciate you, whether it's your work ability or the way you deal with people and situations." As Eloise spoke, she didn't notice a figure passing by the study. "If that's the case, why won't you give me a chance?" Ronnie said, pushing up the glasses on the bridge of his nose. Frankly, he has always been a gifted child since he was young, with good looks and a privileged background. He has always been an excellent student in the eyes of the teachers. Even in the fiercely competitive environment like MIT, he could rely on his own abilities to get into graduate school. He has always felt that although he is not perfect, he is quite outstanding. His parents have some connections with Mrs. Chen. When he returned to the country after graduation, ready to start his own business and make his mark, Eloise's mother came to him, expressing her intentions. In fact, at the beginning, Ronnie was inwardly opposed to the idea, because in his mind, a daughter raised by a family like QS Corporation must be a spoiled princess. After all, born at the peak of life, with wealth and resources beyond imagination, and unaware of the hardships of life. Such a woman usually grows up to be rather arrogant and unreasonable. He does not deny that the temper of a young lady can be cute at times, but he prefers women who are independent and strong. But the temptation of becoming the Deputy General of QS Corporation was too great. Through the platform of QS Corporation, the level of contacts he could access was completely different. He didn't want to miss this opportunity, nor could he miss it. He treated this blind date as a transaction, originally just wanting to go through the motions, but after meeting Eloise, he completely changed his mind. Eloise is an extremely capable woman, decisive in her actions, and has profound insights and analysis on certain matters. Even he has learned a lot from her that he had never touched upon before. He admits that his original thoughts were too superficial, and he has gone from being unwilling to now harboring a longing in his heart. But unfortunately, Eloise doesn't seem to be interested in him. Ronnie, I hope you understand that my appreciation for you is purely in the professional sense. Eloise said, her expression still wearing a faint smile, but her words were so unfeeling. Ronnie was slightly stunned, and after a moment, his expression also showed a hint of helplessness. Is there no possibility at all? No, Eloise said, her slender fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. I don't engage in office romances. The words had come to this point, and Ronnie naturally understood her thoughts. Although he felt unwilling, he was not one to relentlessly pursue someone, especially since his main goal for working at QS Corporation was still his career. Then I understand. I will explain to Mrs. Chin later. The two chatted casually for a few more minutes before Eloise finally ended the call, massaging her sore temples as she stood up from the chair and walked towards the guest room. After returning to the apartment, she removed her makeup, changed her clothes, and went straight into the study while Leonardo was tidying up his room. It was getting late, and he had probably already showered. However, when Eloise approached the guest room, she found the door was not properly closed, leaving a small gap. Standing at the door, Eloise's gaze through the gap fell on Leonardo. Just as she was about to push the door open, she suddenly saw something and froze in place. In an instant, Eloise's expression turned cold, her lips pressed tightly together, with a hint of worry that was hard to erase from her brow. Leonardo was taking medicine, and it wasn't hard to guess what kind. When she saw those 2 boxes of medicine in the suitcase, her mood became somewhat annoyed. Now, seeing the man take the medication with her own eyes, a sudden surge of acidity and pain welled up in her heart, making it difficult for her to breathe for a moment. Leonardo. Eloise finally couldn't help but push the door open and speak up. In the next moment, the man seemed to be startled, trembling all over, and the medicine bottle in his hand fell to the ground, scattering everywhere. Turning back to meet the woman's gaze, Leonardo's pupils contracted sharply, quickly crouching down, frantically stuffing the pills on the ground back into the bottle. However, perhaps due to his extreme panic, his hands were shaking so much that the pills he had just put in were shaken out again. Eloise watched the man's panicked and helpless actions, her brows immediately furrowing, and she quickly stepped forward, grabbing his wrist to stop him. However, the man was in extreme anxiety at this moment, and the uncontrollable restlessness accompanied by the fear in his heart made him shake off the woman's hand, hiding the medicine bottle behind him. The bottle cap was not screwed on, and the pills scattered all over the place, creating a chaotic scene that was suffocating and desperate. The two stood facing each other by the bedside, the man's hair, just out of the shower, still wet, hanging over his forehead, covering the redness in his eyes. The hand behind him was extremely tense, and the plastic medicine bottle began to deform under the force, just like his current mood, extremely twisted. The man quietly stood in place, the atmosphere in the room oppressive to the point of making one's heart race. This was the first time Eloise had witnessed Leonardo in such a state. Although he hadn't said a word or made a move, she felt a sense of sorrow rushing towards her, like a silent, heart-wrenching despair. Leonardo. Eloise said, her nose tingling, and her hand that had been thrown off tried to reach out again. However, just as she was about to touch him, the man panicked and retreated a couple of steps, shouting, "Don't touch me." The voice was torn, much like his current emotions on the verge of collapse. Eloise's hand stopped in midair, not knowing what to do. She had known before that Leonardo suffered from depression, but today was the first time she had seen him in a state of crisis. Over the years, a woman who could handle any situation with ease was now completely frozen in place. A few seconds later, the man seemed to suddenly realize something and threw the medicine bottle away with a loud thud. The sharp sound echoed in the quiet room. Before Eloise could react, the man strode forward, grabbed the hand she had left hanging in the air, pulling her towards him. Holding Eloise tightly in his arms, the man buried his head in the woman's neck, his arm around her back extremely forceful, as if wanting to embed her into his embrace, afraid that she would suddenly leave. His body trembled fiercely, and Eloise felt the man's breath on her shoulder, panicked and helpless. Eloise, Eloise, don't be afraid of me. Please don't be afraid of me. The man spoke, his voice choked with tears, full of despair and fear that made Eloise stiffen in place, not knowing how to respond to his terror and anxiety. Half a minute later, Eloise hugged the man back, her voice unexpectedly sounding distressed. "Leonardo, I'm not afraid. I have never been afraid." "No, you'll hate me. Don't hate me, Eloise. Please don't hate me." A slight pain came from her shoulder, and Eloise knew that Leonardo's emotions had reached a breaking point. "Leonardo, listen to me." Eloise gently patted the man's back, as if trying to soothe his emotions. "I don't hate you." However, this was not effective for the current Leonardo. The man held Eloise, talking to himself, constantly oscillating between denial and begging, showing his low self-esteem, sensitivity, and anxiety. Eloise did not speak again, because any more comfort at this time would be futile. It was unclear how much time passed, but Leonardo seemed to have calmed down a bit, and Eloise also withdrew from his embrace, leading him to the bedside, indicating for him to sit down. Lacking extreme security, the moment he sat down, Leonardo immediately hugged the woman's waist again, clinging to her abdomen, like fish and water, not able to be separated for a second. Eloise had no choice but to hug him back, gently stroking his slightly damp hair, one stroke after another. "Leonardo, you have to believe me." The man did not speak, just tightened his grip on her. A few minutes later, Eloise suddenly pinched the man's chin, forcing him to look up and meet her gaze. "How long has it been?" Eloise asked, her tone more serious than ever. The redness in his eyes was immediately exposed to the woman, and Leonardo wanted to dodge, but Eloise did not give him a chance to escape. The two were in a stalemate for a long time, and eventually, Leonardo was the first to concede. 3 months ago. The man lowered his eyes, his tone gradually calming down at this moment, but filled with deep sadness. In fact, Leonardo knew that he was not a normal person, but all these years, he had disguised himself as the most ordinary person, wandering in this bustling city. But he didn't know when it started. He gradually found it hard to control himself, unable to control his emotions, unable to control his actions. His mind often recalled scenes from his childhood, in that dark villa, the madness and hysteria of the woman. He was afraid that one day he would also become like that. He could hurt himself without any scruples. After all, he was just a rotten person. It didn't matter, but he would not allow himself to hurt Eloise. Selfish desires forced him to stay by Eloise's side, desperately suppressing those growing desires, chaining himself up, before cautiously approaching her. Although since seeing the doctor, he had been taking his medications seriously, for some reason, he felt that he was still unable to escape and had fallen into that extreme. "Leonardo, do you want to take a gamble?" Eloise said, slowly crouching down to one knee in front of Leonardo, lowering all her demeanor. Her hand that had been pinching his chin turned to gently caress his cheeks, staring straight into his eyes, solemnly speaking, "I know it's difficult for you, but I want to ask you to take a chance and gamble on how long I will love you." Leonardo looked at Eloise in front of him, his pupils trembling, his face pale. "Eloise, I can't afford to lose." "Don't be afraid, Leonardo. Let me start first." Eloise's lips curved slightly, her eyes filled with a gentle light, raising her chin slightly, leaving a light kiss on his brow, filled with deep pity and affection. "I bet a lifetime." In the quiet night, the moonlight was exceptionally gentle, shining in from the window, falling on the two of them. In the darkness, The man opened his eyes, staring fixedly at the woman sleeping beside him, the sorrow that had filled his eyes before now dissipated, replaced by an almost insane obsession, like a patient already at the end of his illness, with no chance of recovery. In the dead of night, in the silent room, the man lowered his head slightly, restraining his emotions as he left a kiss on the woman's lips. The emotions surging in his eyes were like silent gale-force winds and torrential rains, making one's heart palpitate with fear. Since you want to gamble, then let's go to the end together. Chapter 41. The following morning, when Eloise woke up, Leonardo was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Last night, the man's emotions had been unstable, and Eloise didn't want to leave him alone to wallow in his thoughts, so she stayed with him until sleep, eventually falling asleep herself. As Eloise walked into the dining room, Leonardo had just emerged from the kitchen. Dressed in simple casual wear, a light-colored apron tied around his waist, sunlight streaming in from outside fell on his profile, making his entire demeanor exceptionally gentle, in stark contrast to the heavy despair of the night before. Noticing the arrival, Leonardo's gaze shifted over, his eyes carrying a faint smile and warmth, as if in a fleeting moment, the man's clean smile was like an angel fallen to earth, making Eloise's heart itch with a desire to ruffle his hair. Last night, the two had agreed to see a psychologist together. Eloise had taken a day off for him, and she herself had postponed her morning schedule. Leonardo had initially refused, as he truly couldn't bear to expose his ugliest side without reservation to Eloise. But Eloise was stubborn in this regard, coaxing and persuading for a long time, and eventually, hugging and kissing, pouring out a multitude of sweet words, the man finally nodded in agreement. By the time Eloise and Leonardo arrived at the clinic, it was already after 9. The psychologist they had an appointment with was an old acquaintance of Eloise's, whom she had met at gatherings before and had some private friendships with. This consultation was arranged last minute with a phone call the night before. The process of the consultation was lengthy. Eloise stood alone in the clinic's corridor, smoking and watching the bustling crowd outside the window, her emotions a complex tangle. The scene from last night was still vivid, the man's bloodshot eyes, trembling body, and panicked, helpless pupils, each memory stirring an almost suffocating pang in her heart. Eloise squinted, the nicotine unable to alleviate the anxiety within her. For over 2 decades, her life had been smooth sailing, but Leonardo was truly the biggest hurdle she had encountered. Momentarily bewitched by his beauty, she had gambled with a playful heart, only to lose herself body and soul. After an unknown amount of time, the door to the office finally opened, and Leonardo walked out, his expression as inscrutable as ever, leaving his emotions indiscernible. Finished? Eloise stubbed out her cigarette and raised an eyebrow towards Leonardo. Yes, Leonardo replied indifferently. I still need to do some tests. Should I accompany you? No need. No one mentioned the results of the consultation, as if wanting to downplay the matter deliberately. After Leonardo left, Gu Yuan, in a white lab coat, walked out of the office, his expression somewhat grave, which made Eloise's heart sink a little. The two stood in the corner of the corridor, a breeze blowing in from the window, accompanying Gu Yuan's voice as it brushed past Eloise's ears. Preliminary diagnosis: it's likely moderate depression. It has a lot to do with his childhood experiences, coupled with his upbringing over the years. It's normal for him to have this condition. As Gu Yuan spoke, his tone was neither sad nor happy, a purely objective statement that made Eloise frown slightly. What are the chances of recovery? It's hard to say. After all, mental illnesses are different from ordinary physical ones. The subjectivity of a person plays a large role, and it can vary greatly from person to person, from a few years to a lifetime. Hearing this, Eloise's urge to smoke resurfaced, but when she went to reach for a cigarette, she found her pack was empty. She had been smoking heavily lately and hadn't even noticed. And his mother had a history of schizophrenia, so his chances of developing it are also very high. Although the symptoms are not yet obvious, Given his current situation, the possibility of developing schizophrenia in the future is not low. At this point, Gu Yuan turned to look at Eloise beside him, meeting her somewhat serious expression, and couldn't help but sigh. He understood Eloise's character and knew that her love affairs over the years had just been games. Quite a few people in the circle had secretly speculated on who would finally tame this young lady, but they hadn't expected the development to be so fantastical. The road ahead was not easy. Gu Yuan had treated too many patients, many of whom were accompanied by their partners. Each couple who came seemed to believe that they could win the final victory together, but the outcome was often one person falling apart. Negative emotions can be contagious, silently eroding your heart. From the initial confident determination to the later self-doubt, many times, people falter halfway. Those who once passionately promised to stand by you will beg you to let them go, and those who once believed they could conquer will eventually choose to succumb. Even the most passionate love will be worn down by endless doubts, suspicions, and tests. Not everyone is as strong-willed as they think. Very often, people with depression, even when they love someone, do so cautiously and silently bear the burden, because in their hearts, they've already determined that this is a futureless affair. They do not want to hurt others or endure disappointment, so they choose to walk alone in the long night. Eloise, I advise you to think it through, Gu Yuan said, his tone sincere, offering friendly advice as a friend. The woman's eyes dimmed slightly, without anger or wavering. She replied indifferently, "There's nothing to consider, I'm not that cowardly." Upon hearing this, Gu Yuan was stunned for a moment, then smiled, his worries gradually dissipating with her words. He almost forgot, she was Eloise. "Indeed, you're different from others," Gu Yuan said, his expression becoming a bit more relaxed, "but it's not an incurable disease. As long as you take your medication on time and pay attention to emotional regulation in daily life, there's a high chance of recovery." "I'll take your well wishes," Eloise said, raising an eyebrow, her expression as bold as ever. When Eloise and Leonardo left the private clinic, it was nearly noon. The test results were acceptable. The man exercised regularly, so his physical condition was in good shape. After picking up some medication, they left the clinic. After all, mental illnesses are not like other diseases. They are a long process that can only be alleviated through long-term regulation. After eating outside, Eloise planned to take Leonardo back to the apartment. She had taken a day off for him, so he naturally didn't need to go to work in the afternoon. However, Leonardo insisted on going back on his own, and Eloise did not insist, leaving Leonardo at the restaurant before driving to the company. Yet, instead of returning to the apartment, the man who should have gone back took a taxi to another district. As he got out of the taxi, the man's expression was exceptionally calm, with only a hint of coldness in his brow. Familiar surroundings, but after a decade of changes, many things had long become unfamiliar. Although he had lived here for nearly 10 years, everything now seemed foreign. No memories here were worth cherishing. Perhaps in this district, he had once laughed and played, but what remained in his mind now was endless darkness. Human hearts are cold, a truth he understood at a very young age. He would not have returned to this place filled with pain, but there were still matters unresolved that he needed to settle. Following the path buried deep in his memory, Leonardo arrived at the familiar two-story villa, his expression cold and indifferent, devoid of warmth, more like a messenger from hell, chilling to the bone. The low gate to the courtyard was not locked, and the people in the villa didn't seem to have the time or energy to pay attention to it. Stepping back into this nightmare-like place once more, the man's emotions remained completely unmoved. He slowly pushed open the metal gate in front of him and walked in at a leisurely pace, his every move exuding a hint of elegance that was chilling. Step by step, the man walked through the somewhat dilapidated courtyard and stopped in front of the villa's main entrance. Ding-dong! The doorbell broke the silence, signaling the calm before the storm. After a couple of minutes, the villa's main door opened. However, when the woman who opened the door saw Leonardo standing outside, she froze, her expression suddenly becoming extremely vicious, pointing at the man's nose and shouting, "Boy, how dare you show your face here? You beast, how dare you appear before me? Where's your conscience? Did the dog eat it?" Filthy words spewed from the woman's mouth, her face as ugly as her heart, hideous beyond measure. The woman had not been doing well lately, her once flourishing face now covered in wrinkles, her hair graying, yet she still wore exquisite makeup and expensive jewelry, as if trying to maintain her last shred of dignity. Leonardo raised an eyebrow, his gaze directly bypassing the woman and landing on the living room behind her. Bags of various sizes were scattered on the floor, clearly packing for a move. The man's lips curled slightly, and a chill mixed with faint mockery swept over, causing the woman to freeze on the spot. After occupying someone else's things for so many years, it's about time to give them back, don't you think? The man said, his tone neither light nor heavy, more like the whisper of the Grim Reaper, making the woman's face turn deathly pale in an instant. Although the man was smiling, there was not a trace of warmth to be felt from him. His pitch-black pupils were bottomless, and one glance felt like plunging into an icy cavern. After a while, the woman finally seemed to react, her face flushing red, as if feeling ashamed of her fear and retreat just now. "How dare you talk like that, you beast?" The woman clenched her teeth and spoke, raising her hand to slap the man. However, there were no outsiders present now, and Leonardo had no need to pretend to be pitiful. A glint of bloodthirsty intent flashed in his eyes, and in the next moment, he grabbed the woman's wrist fiercely, holding it in midair, and in less than a second, his other hand swiftly locked around her throat, slamming her against the nearby door with a bang. "Beast?" Leonardo raised an eyebrow slightly, the violent aura gushing from his eyes causing the woman's pupils to contract sharply, her heart skipping a beat. A tightening sensation around her neck, as if a tidal wave of suffocation surged over, made her begin to struggle. He would kill her. He really would kill her. Fear from deep within her heart ignited the woman's will to survive, as her nails painted a bright red fiercely scratched at the man's hand, but he seemed oblivious to the pain, his arm around her neck unmoving. "Who exactly is the beast?" You let go of me." I am your aunt." The woman's tirade had no effect on Leonardo. The title, aunt, was merely a word in his heart, devoid of any deeper meaning and instead even more repugnant. Watching the other's last-ditch struggle, Leonardo's heart remained unmoved, neither sad nor joyful, like an emotionless robot. The force in his hand continued to increase, and the woman, completely deprived of oxygen, began to roll her eyes, her pain causing her to abandon all dignity and plead, I'm sorry, Leonardo. I'm sorry. I am the beast. I am the beast." As soon as the words left her mouth, a hint of mockery flashed in the man's eyes, followed by him withdrawing his hand. The woman fell to the ground unexpectedly, her hands clutching her throat, gasping for air, the thrill of escaping death making her tremble all over, unable to regain her senses for a long time. Leonardo looked down at the aunt, sitting on the ground, a wretched state with none of the previous arrogance. The man's expression showed a trace of disgust, shaking his hand that had just held the woman's throat, as if touching something dirty. "Don't worry, I wouldn't go to jail for scum like you," Leonardo said, glancing at the familiar furnishings inside the villa, his memories of the past gradually becoming clearer, and the restlessness in his heart began to ferment. As Leonardo was lost in thought, the woman who had been sitting on the ground finally regained some strength, quickly stood up, and ran into the house, then pointed at Leonardo at the door and shouted, her eyes flashing with venomous light. "Leonardo, what are you so cocky about? You're just hanging on to the daughter of a millionaire. Sooner or later, she'll find out about your ugly face, realize that you're just using her. People like you don't deserve her. She'll get tired of you in a few years, and see how arrogant you are then." Every word from the woman was like a sharp knife, stabbing fiercely into the man's heart. The hands hanging at his side clenched into fists. The man's eyes immediately became vicious, with a storm of bloodthirst in his gaze, the bulging veins on his forehead enough to prove that his emotions were on the verge of collapse. The woman finished speaking, meeting the man's gaze, and her neck seemed to start hurting again, the residual fear making her instinctively take a few steps back. The atmosphere inside the villa became extremely tense, like a taut violin string that could snap at any moment. After an unknown amount of time, the man's lips curled slightly, his face no less sullen than before, his thin lips slightly parted, speaking again in a tone so cold it was startling. "You have 2 days to move out the rest of your things, or I will sue you for court for illegally occupying someone else's property and claim compensation for more than a decade." After the man finished speaking, he turned and was about to leave. Behind him came the woman's broken cries, a desperate lament. "Ah, Leonardo, your uncle has already been arrested, and you're still so heartless. Are you trying to drive us to a dead end?" The man's footsteps paused slightly, a glimmer of unclear light flashing in his eyes. In the next moment, he slightly turned his head, his exquisitely handsome profile under the sunlight, yet the words he spoke were extremely indifferent. "It's none of my business." At the farthest corner of the district, it was once a secret base for children more than a decade ago, but now it had long become a wasteland, with only weeds everywhere and a gnarled old tree. Beside the dead tree was a discarded iron barrel, and at this moment, the man was standing next to the barrel, the chill emanating from his entire body reflecting the surrounding decay, appearing particularly desolate. In the next moment, the man standing in place suddenly moved, kicking fiercely at the discarded iron barrel. Bang! The piercing sound broke the deathly silence, followed by one after another sound, filled with hostility, oppressing to the point of suffocation. The man almost insanely kicked at the discarded iron barrel, his usually expressionless face showing a hint of ferocity, his eyes a crimson red, filled with almost chaotic rage, startling. The words the woman said before he left kept echoing in his ears, like a curse, stirring up all the violence in his heart. Use? How could he? How could he possibly use her? He loved her so much that he was going mad. Nonsense. It's all nonsense. What does getting tired of you in a few years mean? She clearly said she was serious. She said she would always be with him. Dust swirled around, the man's movements particularly intense, as if venting the anger and unease from within. His emotions continued to spiral out of control, an unstoppable anger pulling him to the brink of madness. At that moment, amidst the cacophony of blows, a cell phone ringtone suddenly rang out, and the man's movements abruptly halted. His eyes slightly darkened, suppressing the surging emotions in them. The man took out his phone from his pocket and, upon seeing the name displayed on the screen, all the storm settled in an instant. The man pressed the answer key and placed the phone beside his ear. "Where are you?" A woman's voice came from the other end of the phone. Leonardo's hand holding the phone tightened, and in the next moment, his tone became his usual self, tinged with a hint of intimacy. "I'm at the supermarket. What do you want to eat tonight?" "Spaghetti, but I still have a few meetings at the office, so I might be a bit late. You can eat first when the time comes." The hostility in his eyebrows gradually faded. The man's expression softened a lot. Restraining his slightly panting breath, Leonardo said, "I'll wait for you." The expected response. Eloise on the other end of the phone knew the man's stubbornness, so she didn't persuade him further at this moment, simply hummed softly in acknowledgement. The man's lips curled slightly, a warm glow in his eyes, his unease and agitation soothed swiftly upon hearing the woman's voice. But just then, another man's voice suddenly came from the other end of the phone. "Eloise, it's time. We should go into the conference room." Leonardo's face immediately turned cold, gloom once again climbing onto his brow. He recognized the voice. It was the man who had talked with Eloise in the study last night, the man Eloise said she admired. Leonardo's lips tightened, and just as Eloise was about to hang up the phone, he suddenly spoke again, his tone tinged with a slight coquettishness and attachment. "Eloise, come back early." Eloise on the other end of the phone was slightly taken aback, her heart softening instantly at the man's small display of vulnerability. A bit helpless, Eloise couldn't help but chuckle softly and replied, "I know. Wait for me at home. The call ended, and the man slowly put down his phone, the previous weakness suddenly disappearing. He lifted his foot again and kicked fiercely at the discarded iron barrel. The heavy barrel trembled slightly from the impact, and the rusted iron skin was dented in one spot. Muttering a curse under his breath, the man straightened his clothes and then strode towards the main street. The man's footsteps were steady and quick, and his thumb swiftly swiped across the phone screen, dialing a number. After it drops 5 points, go all in directly. The person receiving the order seemed very surprised and couldn't help but remind him, Sir, wait a bit longer. Aren't you afraid of getting trapped? Don't talk too much, just do as I say. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the meeting officially ended. Eloise quickly packed up the documents on the table and swiftly left the conference room. Because she had taken a half-day off in the morning, Eloise had asked Luke to arrange all the schedules for the afternoon, so overtime work became unavoidable. She always remembered her little boyfriend's reminder at home, so when she saw the sky darkening, she couldn't help but feel a bit anxious. Eloise! A voice from behind suddenly called out. Eloise stopped and turned to look. You left your phone, Ronnie said, approaching quickly, holding the phone in his hand and offering it to Eloise with a polite smile. Eloise raised an eyebrow, took the phone and softly thanked him, was about to turn and leave when she heard Ronnie speak again. Is the one on your screen your little boyfriend? Eloise was taken aback for a moment, then her scarlet lips curled into a bewitching smile as she said, Yes, he's my little sweetheart. As soon as the words fell, Eloise ignored Ronnie's surprise and turned to leave. The man watched the woman's departing figure, and it took him a while to finally come back to his senses, letting out a soft, helpless laugh. Chapter 42. Eloise returns to her apartment as darkness fully envelopes the sky, yet the food she brings home remains warm. Earlier, before leaving the company, her words to Ronnie were meant to discourage him, but upon seeing her young boyfriend at home, Eloise finds the term sweetheart fitting for him without any awkwardness. When she opens the door, his eyes light up as if he's a beloved pet welcoming back its owner, behaving obediently. Unlike his demeanor in public, when they are alone, the man seems to instinctively shed all pretenses, like a wild animal retracting its fangs, only lowering its guard in front of you. Compared to when Eloise first met Leonardo, he still exudes a sense of aggression, like a young wolf ready to snarl at anyone who comes too close. There's a strange sense of accomplishment in taming a little wolf pup, but it's unclear who has actually tamed whom. After dinner, Eloise offers to clean up the table, but her suggestion is immediately vetoed by the man. In such matters, she always gives in to him, and so she enjoys the luxury of retreating to the bedroom to wash her hair and take a bath. Half an hour later, Eloise emerges from the room, her hair freshly dried, and heads straight to the kitchen. She opens a bottle of red wine and carries a glass, walking barefoot towards the living room. Above her head shines a warm yellow light, and through the large glass wall, the city's nightscape is unobstructed. After an uncertain amount of time, halfway through her glass of wine, Leonardo emerges from the bedroom. Seeing her sitting on the sofa, he pauses, his gaze deepening abruptly. The woman is wearing her familiar black slip dress, the silk fabric reflecting a sense of elegance and silently adding a touch of sensuality. Her black hair drapes behind her, revealing a vast expanse of snow-white skin. Her beautifully angled shoulders and smooth collarbones are all visually striking. Leonardo's gaze falls on the wine glass in the woman's hand, then shifts to her slightly reddened lips, a glimmer of obscure light flashing in his eyes. Why don't you come over? Eloise asks, raising an eyebrow, her eyes gleaming like a queen of the night, seductive and enchanting. The woman doesn't seem to care about her current image, nor does she feel any embarrassment about appearing in front of the opposite sex in just a nightgown. A chaotic thought emerges in her mind, though pointless, it's annoyingly persistent. A few seconds later, the man walks towards the sofa, his expression devoid of emotion, but with a hint of chill. Eloise places her glass on the coffee table, hooks her finger around the man's, and asks indifferently, Have you been taking your medicine properly? The man seems to be sulking, but doesn't reject Eloise's small gesture. Yes. Why the sudden pout? Eloise says, her laughter growing thicker. Leonardo looks down at the woman beside him, the slight tilt of her head revealing a delicate jawline, with an air of invitation that inevitably stirs wicked thoughts. Yet, the woman's expression is so bold, even though she's looking up, she seems more like a dominant figure. No. The man looks away, his gaze landing on her bare feet, the creases in his brow deepening. Why aren't you wearing shoes? Eloise tugs at the man's hand, and Leonardo sits down beside her. Does it matter? Eloise asks, laughing lightly. It's cold, dress more warmly next time, Leonardo says, his head slightly lowered, his tone light as if the reminder is just a casual utterance. Eloise looks down at her nightgown, as if suddenly understanding something, the laughter in her eyes deepening. She leans towards the man, one slender arm wrapping around his shoulder, the other gently caressing his face, applying slight pressure to force his gaze to meet hers. Are you jealous? Eloise asks, her fingertips lightly stroking his face, a teasing light in her eyes. Leonardo is caught off guard by her gaze, and he quickly averts his eyes. You're overthinking. However, Eloise doesn't believe Leonardo's unconvincing explanation. Her fingers slide down, stopping at his chin, then abruptly lifting, leaving him no room to avoid her gaze. Rest assured, this appearance, I only show it to you. The man's breath catches, his rational mind telling him that her words are likely just a placating remark, yet the joy in his heart is undeniable. His mind suddenly recalls the man's voice from the phone call earlier that afternoon. The fleeting happiness disappears in an instant. Leonardo knows that Eloise is glib-tongued, fond of using extremely flirtatious words to tease him, a mischievous habit of hers. However, can these words be taken seriously? He's unsure. He knows he should just see these as momentary sweet nothings, not to be taken to heart, but his heart is craving for every word she says to be true. Struggling between doubt and speculation for the truth, it's contradictory, he knows it's not right, yet he can't stop his own rampant thoughts. Perhaps, on another level, even if her words are true now, what about the future? What if, one day, she does as that crazy woman said, tires of him? There are too many people more outstanding than him, and perhaps she's still highly interested in him at this moment, but interest fades over time. The world is too dazzling, and with her status, she will surely meet thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of outstanding men in the future, like that. Ronnie. So, does he even stand a chance? How's work at the company? Leonardo suddenly changes the subject. It's fine, Eloise says, her thumb pressing gently on the man's cool thin lips, and as he speaks, his lips rub against her finger, heating the surrounding air. Why the sudden interest? I just thought that with an additional vice president, work should be a bit lighter. Eloise hasn't yet noticed the deeper meaning in the man's words, her gaze still fixed on his lips, seemingly contemplating how to savor them. It has become easier, more capable than I expected. At these words, the man's expression darkens, and he abruptly pulls away from the woman's teasing hand, turning his head, his tone cold. It seems Eloise holds him in high regard. The spacious living room is suddenly filled with a sour scent, and if Eloise doesn't understand now, she'd be a fool. Her wrist is held in midair by the man, and Eloise can't break free, so she uses her other hand to turn his stubborn head towards her. What are you thinking, little boyfriend? Nothing, Leonardo says, his expression seemingly calm, but at a closer look, he seems a bit pitiful. His eyelashes tremble, his skin still pale under the warm yellow light, his brow slightly furrowed, resembling a tragic heroine in a palace drama, suffering for love. I just feel that he also seems to appreciate you quite a bit, the man says, adding after a moment, earlier in the office, it was evident that he's quite interested in you. He heard the man expressing his affection for her last night, and he heard that Eloise's parents sent the man. Able to work alongside Eloise daily and winning the favor of her parents, Ronnie has all the advantages, while he can only rely on the woman's current interest to survive. A light chuckle suddenly breaks the silence, and Leonardo's expression turns even colder. But within a few seconds, the woman suddenly releases his head, pulling her hand free, and returns to her original position, her movements leisurely, exuding a lazy elegance from her bones. "Don't worry, I'm not interested in that type," Eloise says, picking up her phone from the coffee table, continuing, "Besides, I showed him my phone." Leonardo is slightly taken aback, not understanding what she means. In the next moment, the woman sitting on the sofa suddenly lights up her phone screen and then brings it in front of Leonardo. The man is momentarily unprepared, staring at the lock screen for a long time, and only when he realizes what it is, his expression darkens, his cheeks heating up as he reaches out to grab her phone. However, Eloise seems to have anticipated Leonardo's intention, her phone hand suddenly withdrawing, hiding it behind her, teasingly looking at the man in front of her. "Eloise!" Leonardo meets the woman's laughing gaze, his face warming even more. Where did these stolen photos come from? And set them as the phone's wallpaper. What was she thinking? What if someone else sees them? Moreover, that photo, how silly. The man's lips pressed together, the melancholy wiped away by Eloise, now glaring at the grinning woman, his heart a mixture of embarrassment and anger, wanting to reach for her phone, but not daring to move forward. "Why aren't you calling me Eloise again?" Eloise says, pretending to clean her ear, her face still mischievous. "Little boyfriend, you're not being good." "Eloise, give me the phone." "What for?" "This is my treasure, and now you are mine. Isn't it good to let me claim my ownership?" Eloise says, slightly puffing up her chest, as if expecting the man to not dare to make a move. This remark causes the blush on the man's face to spread to his ears, his mouth slightly open as if wanting to refute something, but after a moment, he bites his lip. The emotions in his heart cannot be hidden. Although childish, these kinds of actions similar to ordinary couples, he finds himself utterly unable to resist. He wants to occupy her life, occupy her whole self, whether it's her phone wallpaper or her heart. It's too stupid. After a while, Leonardo manages to squeeze out these words from between his teeth. The voice, though light, landed solidly in Eloise's ears. Her gaze fell on the man's reddened ears, and she couldn't resist teasing him. "Are you silly?" "How cute," Eloise said. As soon as the words left her mouth, Eloise placed her phone back on the coffee table and, like an elegant Persian cat, gradually approached the man beside her. Her body slightly bent, slender arms propped on the sofa, the collar of her dress slightly loosened, and Leonardo could see the view inside with just a light glance. It was completely unadorned. His back instantly tightened, and the dryness of his just-showered body began to sweat again. Inexperienced youngsters were always lacking in control in this aspect. Just seeing a little something would make them restless, their blood boiling, and the man's sitting posture on the sofa changed subtly without being noticed. Leonardo's brows knitted tightly, his gaze landing on the wine glass, as if he had absolutely no interest in the woman's deliberate seduction. However, his flushed cheeks, shallow breaths, and taut muscles revealed his thoughts completely. His eyes darkened slightly, and he couldn't help but recall the scene he accidentally saw when meeting Patrick in the president's office of Align Corporation, the screen of his phone, which displayed a photo of Eloise. A dark glint flickered in his pupils, disappearing in an instant, and then his mouth pressed into a line as he said, "It's unfair." "What's wrong?" At this moment, the woman's fair hand landed on the man's black casual pants, the strong color contrast adding a few more visual impacts at this time, and the air in the living room began to feel a bit sticky. The man didn't reply, but Eloise wasn't stupid. A few seconds later, she understood. Then, she stretched out her long legs and directly sat on the man's lap, cupping Leonardo's face with both hands, staring at him intensely and raising an eyebrow. "Do you want it?" Extremely suggestive words. Leonardo didn't know how to answer. The woman in front of him was so close, dressed so lightly, the alluring scene from before still lingering, making his throat tighten, and he didn't know where to look. At this moment, the woman's hand suddenly moved, reaching down without any hesitation. Leonardo was startled, and even his voice became a bit panicked. "Jean, Eloise." However, Eloise's hand didn't land there, but reached into the side pocket of the pants, quickly pulling out the phone, not giving any time for reaction, and scanned the man's face to unlock it, opening the phone's camera directly. Realizing what Eloise was about to do, the man had just relaxed when a familiar fragrance reached his nose. The next moment, the woman's arm wrapped around the man's neck, pressing herself against him, without any gaps. His chest unexpectedly felt a warm softness, and Leonardo's pupils shook violently, his whole body stiffening, not daring to move at all. The woman's actions were too bold, and Leonardo was just a young man, at this moment even less able to control himself, the symbol of male aggression quickly rising. He felt he was about to explode. Not daring to let the other person find out about his sordid actions, Leonardo was about to struggle when the woman's hand around his neck tightened again, coldly saying, "Don't move." Eloise's lips pressed against the skin on his neck, the sensation of rubbing against each other when speaking causing Leonardo to instantly break out in goosebumps, quickly raising his hands in surrender, even his breathing becoming cautious. Although he knew Eloise had always had a good figure, Leonardo didn't expect her to be so well endowed, the sensation unprecedented, the rising and falling of his chest with each breath becoming even stronger, leaving Leonardo with no room to resist. Leonardo didn't understand. Didn't she feel anything? How could she be so calm? However, the woman in the selfie didn't have much thought to spare for her little boyfriend's emotions at the moment, purely treating the man as a tool, one hand around his neck, the other holding the phone for selfies. Her slightly warm lips pressing against the man's neck the whole time, posing in an extremely intimate manner. After taking 3 or 4 photos, satisfied with the results, Eloise finally released Leonardo, tossing the phone back to him. He fumbled to catch it, and after seeing the photo in the album, Leonardo's eyes heated up again. The woman in the photo was not wearing makeup, but she was still stunningly beautiful, the pose full of possessiveness subtly indicating the relationship between the two. "Here, set this as your wallpaper," the woman's voice sounded next to his ear. Leonardo looked at the photo on the phone. The joy in his heart couldn't be faked, but how could he set this kind of photo as his lock screen? Strictly speaking, this photo could also be considered a couple's shot. Even if his face wasn't shown, his back and the back of his head occupied most of the frame, covering the woman's body tightly. Without any revealing scenes, but it strangely made Leonardo feel ashamed. Seeing the man hesitate for a long time without any action, Eloise threatened, "Don't want it? If not, I'll delete it." As soon as the words left her mouth, Leonardo quickly set the photo as both the home screen and lock screen wallpaper, then immediately turned the phone over on the sofa, doing it so quickly, afraid that Eloise really would delete the photo. Eloise watched the man's actions, unable to suppress her laughter. Before she could laugh for long, her waist suddenly tightened. The distance between the two that had just been slightly separated was quickly pulled close by the man again. The arm around her waist was unmoving, extremely domineering. Eloise looked at Leonardo, who was close at hand, and couldn't help but raise an eyebrow, her eyes flashing with interest, as if waiting for his next move. "Why did you suddenly think of drinking red wine?" the man asked in a low voice. "It helps with sleep," Eloise replied. "Is it good? Want to taste it?" The man's eyes darkened, his gaze landing on the woman's lips. After a moment, he hummed softly, his voice slightly hoarse, tinged with desire. He was suffering, needing release. In the next moment, Eloise's lips lightly touched the man's corner of the mouth, withdrawing before he could react, so fast it made Leonardo feel frustrated. "Eloise." As soon as the man finished speaking, a slender finger pressed against his lips. "What should you call me?" Leonardo immediately understood, his eyes flickering with darkness, the flesh on his face gradually fading, the emotionless expression on his face now carrying a seductive charm. His eyes rippled, and the next moment, the man spoke softly. "Honey." Having gotten what she wanted, Eloise smiled, leaning in to press against the man's forehead, her voice carrying a hint of breathiness. "Good boy." The second kiss was passionate, the intertwining of lips and tongues filled with intimacy. In the quiet living room, the sound of their shallow breaths and occasional slurping noises were exceptionally clear, igniting the surrounding air. In the midst of confusion and desire, the man's hand gradually climbed up the woman's slender back, driven by desire, instinctively exploring that realm yet to be touched. Leonardo wanted to know just how soft it was. However, just as he was about to succeed, his wrist suddenly tightened, and the next moment the woman abruptly retreated, pulling out a transparent thread that snapped in the air. "No, this is a reward for good boys," Eloise said. Leonardo pursed his lips, his gaze on the woman bright to the point of startling, with an almost crazy possessiveness and aggression hidden beneath the faint mist. "Am I not good?" The man's words carried a hint of grievance, and upon closer listen, there was also a trace of temptation. Eloise chuckled, naturally not falling for his facade. There were no tools for the deed in the apartment, and when the time came and they really couldn't hold back, it wouldn't be easy to clean up. In the next moment, Eloise ruffled the man's hair, releasing his hand, retreating completely so decisively. "It's getting late. Time to sleep," she said. After getting off the man, Eloise stood beside the sofa. Just as she was about to leave, the man sitting in place suddenly moved again, grabbing her wrist. The man looked up slightly messy bangs hanging over his forehead, looking very docile, his wet eyes like a panicked puppy on the roadside, seeking help from its owner. "Honey, help me," the man's request echoed in the living room, causing Eloise's gaze to darken. Her gaze gradually lowered, feeling the high morale of someone through his pants. Upon getting a hold of it, Eloise couldn't help but marvel. The man's restrained panting could be heard, occasionally releasing a few off-key moans, his flushed cheeks and taut body. Everything looked so adorable. Eloise was not an experienced person, but some people's reactions were too honest, allowing her to quickly grasp the skills involved. This was an unprecedented experience for Leonardo, all senses focused on her hand. As if the whole world was under her control, pain and pleasure were mixed together, leaving him unable to resist. However, the fact was indeed so. She really held his life in her hand. Light or heavy, both made him hard to withstand. It was thought to be a long battle, but the progress seemed surprisingly fast. With a muffled groan, the battle ended, leaving both of them stunned, and the living room suddenly fell silent. After a moment, the man's expression darkened, his lips tightly pressed together, his face looking more miserable than ever. Eloise didn't expect that her little boyfriend would be all show but no substance. Chapter 43. The next morning, the two sat across from each other at the dining table, the atmosphere tinged with awkwardness. The man's expression remained tense throughout, appearing calm on the surface, but a hint of cool detachment lingered in his brow. Since the incident last night, Leonardo's face had remained like this, and it was unclear what he was so upset about. Eloise couldn't understand why it wasn't her who should be angry. After all, the issue of stamina was crucial for future happiness, and as the direct beneficiary, she didn't feel much grievance. Yet, it was him who seemed to be the one throwing a fit first. Recalling the scenes from last night, Eloise couldn't help but want to laugh. It was indeed the man's first time, his joyful face extremely endearing. Despite his usual icy demeanor, he unexpectedly had such a moving side. Although it ended somewhat abruptly, Eloise didn't take it too seriously. Considering the subjective factors, perhaps she had subconsciously set her expectations too high after seeing that size, so she was caught off guard at the end. Now thinking back, she couldn't quite remember the actual scenes from that moment, but she vividly recalled someone's reaction while she was wiping her hands. The man had covered his face in a mix of embarrassment and anger, then hurriedly cleaned up the mess under him and quickly retreated to his room with a dark face, not uttering a single word throughout, leaving Eloise in a daze. So when Eloise saw Leonardo this morning, she was surprised. She had thought he would hide away for a few more days, but instead, he was back after just one night. In the quiet dining room, Eloise had just set down her utensils and glanced at him, intending to tease him a bit more. But then she noticed something and changed her words at the last moment. "What happened to your hand?" On the man's pale hand, several red scratches were quite noticeable. She hadn't noticed them last night, but now they looked somewhat frightening. Still stewing in his anger, Leonardo didn't immediately respond. His gaze followed Eloise's to his hand, and his eyes darkened. His voice, though light, carried an eerie chill when he spoke. "It's nothing, scratched by a stray cat." "A cat?" Eloise frowned, staring at the wound for a long time, feeling secretly suspicious, but unable to pinpoint what was off. "A stray cat on the street?" "Yeah, felt sorry for it and tried to help, but it didn't appreciate it. Maybe I just don't get along with animals. Should we go to the hospital?" "No need, I think it's fine." Eloise looked at Leonardo in front of her, his cool expression unchanged from usual. "All right then, remember to put some ointment on it." Shortly before 1 in the afternoon, after finishing lunch, Leonardo returned to his office. As he was about to get some water, he encountered an unexpected visitor in the pantry. Patrick. Leonardo stood at the doorway, a flicker of darkness in his eyes that quickly vanished as he walked into the pantry as usual. A loud thud broke the silence of the room. Patrick, who was playing with his phone, glanced up and saw his phone lying on the floor. Noticing the man at the water dispenser, he didn't think much of it and picked up the phone, saying, "Hey, buddy, you dropped your phone." Leonardo turned to meet Patrick's gaze, looked down at his black screen, and then smiled, reaching out. "Thanks." As his finger touched the lock button, the black screen lit up, revealing an extremely intimate photo that immediately caught both their eyes. Leonardo was about to retrieve his phone when Patrick suddenly changed his mind and held on, creating a tense standoff in the air. The atmosphere in the pantry grew strange, tinged with a subtle tension. The man's gaze darkened, while the corners of his mouth subtly rose. He looked up, meeting the boy's sullen gaze without flinching. "Something on your mind?" Leonardo asked, raising an eyebrow. "Where did you get this photo?" At this moment, Patrick's expression was tense, his brows knit with anger, his eyes burning with increasing fury. He wasn't blind. He recognized the person on the phone screen at a glance. Eloise never posted selfies on social media, let alone such a private photo. The phone screen was still lit, showing a photo where the woman was embracing the man in an extremely intimate pose, her lips pressed against his neck, her eyes alluring, her white and slender arm contrasting with the dark short-sleeved shirt on the man. Stunningly beautiful. Black hair, fair skin, red lips. It was the woman he daydreamed about, the one he had tried so hard to get close to. Yet here she was, appearing on someone else's phone in such a manner. Leonardo noted all of Patrick's emotional changes, the smile never leaving his lips, and he pulled harder on the phone. "Mr. He, could you please return my phone?" Their gazes locked, each reading hostility in the other's eyes. In matters of identifying rivals, men had an innate sense of acuity. In this cramped pantry, a silent battle began to unfold. "What's your relationship with Eloise?" Patrick asked through clenched teeth, though he already knew the truth in his heart. Eloise had mentioned before that she had someone she liked, but he had inquired around and found no news of Eloise being in a relationship. Later, he asked Jim, who gave the same answer, yet he still harbored a sliver of hope. To his surprise, his fantasies were shattered so unexpectedly today. Patrick wasn't afraid of Eloise dating. He knew her nature, and such relationships were just games to her, meaningless if not genuine. So initially, upon knowing Eloise had someone she liked, he took it as merely a pretext to brush him off. As time passed, nothing seemed to change with Eloise, yet it only made him more apprehensive. But the truth was, his worst fears seemed to be coming true. It seemed Eloise had really been lured away by another man. Patrick understood Eloise. She would never swap phone screensavers and relationships, as it held no meaning for her. His own wallpaper was a surreptitious shot he had taken in secret, but this photo in front of him was clearly an intimate selfie of Eloise. And, unmistakably, the remaining silhouette in the photo, the one embraced and kissed by Eloise, was this arrogant man in front of him. "You already know, don't you?" Leonardo said, exerting force, and the phone was snatched back into his hand. The man checked the phone thoroughly, ensuring it wasn't damaged, then pocketed it calmly. "I don't believe it," Patrick said, his face contorted with rage, but in front of Leonardo, it looked more like a puppy barking at a lion, harmless, lacking any real threat. "You can go left out the door and ask the others in the CO's office," Leonardo said, turning back to fill his water, as if he had no intention of paying attention to him. Patrick had never been so insulted. In the next moment, his boiling anger clouded his judgment, and he stepped forward, grabbing the man's collar forcefully and pinning him against the wall. Leonardo was caught off guard, and his mug fell to the ground with a crash, shattering into pieces. Behind him was a hard wall, and Leonardo looked down at the boy in front of him, his eyes narrowing slightly. In an instant, a cold glint flashed, and the air around him seemed to chill by several degrees. Patrick was half a head shorter than Leonardo, and, even though he was now grabbing the man's collar, he was still looking up. Clearly, it was he who was in a fit of rage, yet in terms of height and aura, he was significantly overshadowed by Leonardo. "What are you pulling at?" Patrick said, his eyes clouded by jealousy, making him appear somewhat pathetic at this moment. It was clear who was superior and who was inferior. The corners of Leonardo's mouth gradually turned downwards, and his expression slowly turned towards indifference. A few seconds later, the man raised his hand and forcefully pulled Patrick's hand off his collar. The boy's strength seemed to be insignificant in his eyes. His wrist was painfully grasped, and Patrick glared at the man in front of him, watching him elegantly smooth his tie and collar, his every move exuding the arrogance of a victor. At this moment, even if Patrick was blind and foolish, he could tell that the man in front of him was showing off, declaring his ownership over something. Unable to help cursing inwardly, Patrick gradually calmed down, realizing that this opponent was not on the same level as the previous ones. If he acted rashly, he might end up being scolded by Eloise. Besides, they were now in a line corporation, and the man in front of him was Jim's recently hired assistant. He didn't have the right to act recklessly in someone else's territory. "I wonder why Mr. He is so angry. Does this matter have anything to do with you?" Leonardo said, glancing sideways. His expression was almost shouting, "None of your business." The fire that had just subsided instantly flared up again, and the hands by his side clenched into fists. After a few seconds, he finally held back. As if thinking of something, the corners of Patrick's mouth curved slightly, his tone full of sarcasm. "Do you know how long the average length of Eloise's relationships is?" Leonardo's eyes darkened slightly, remaining silent on the spot. Seeing the man's reaction, Patrick's smile grew, and the next moment, he stepped forward, speaking into Leonardo's ear with a gleeful voice. 3 months. The longest relationship she's ever had was only 3 months. How long do you think you can last? Don't be so arrogant, or I'll feel embarrassed for you when you get dumped," Patrick said, turning to leave. Leonardo watched Patrick's back, his eyes flashing with a hint of darkness. The next moment, his thin lips parted slightly, and the man's cold voice echoed in the quiet pantry. "I made a bet with her about how long we can be together." In the next moment, Patrick's footsteps came to a halt at the door. She said she'd bet on forever. After a pause, the man asked, "Do you want to bet on it?" In the end, Patrick didn't say anything, kicking the door in anger before storming off. And Leonardo stood there, looking at the empty doorway, then shifted his gaze to the mess on the floor, his eyes growing up even more profound. After a while, the man who had stood still finally moved, taking out his phone from his pocket and dialing a number. In a short while, a familiar voice came from the other end of the phone. "What's wrong?" The man's hand holding the phone tightened, and the mood that had been disturbed by Patrick gradually calmed down. Not receiving an answer, Eloise, sitting in her office chair, slightly raised her eyebrows and asked again, "What? Do you miss me again?" Leonardo's mouth twitched slightly, and a dark light flashed in his eyes, completely different from the arrogant attitude he had shown in front of Patrick. At this moment, the man's tone was tinged with a hint of helplessness and disappointment. "Eloise, can I tell everyone about our relationship?" Eloise on the other end of the phone was slightly taken aback, suppressing the doubts in her heart, her tone seemingly indifferent yet full of self-evident certainty. "Why ask me? Leonardo, this is your business. Don't humble yourself so much, we are in a normal relationship. Whatever you want to do, just follow your heart." Hearing the woman's response, the emotions in Leonardo's eyes surged even more fiercely, and under his expressionless face, there was a man almost madly restraining and suppressing himself. "Do you think I'm unworthy?" The man said, kneeling down, one hand holding the phone and the other picking up the ceramic fragments on the ground. His fingertips accidentally brushed against the sharp edge, and a drop of bright red blood immediately seeped out of the wound. However, the man seemed to feel no pain, staring at the drop of dark red blood, his gaze intense, his expression devoid of emotion. Paired with his deep eyes, there was an oddly beautiful feeling. Hearing this, Eloise naturally sensed that something was wrong. Her expression became serious, but she was not foolish enough to ask him directly what had happened. Some things, if one wants to say, will naturally speak. If one doesn't want to say, no matter how much one asks, one won't open their mouth. Don't overthink. I'm not someone who would put myself in a difficult position. The meaning of these words was very clear. If she thought he was unworthy, then she wouldn't have pursued him from the beginning, let alone proposed to be with him. Having gotten the answer he wanted, in a place where Eloise couldn't see, the corners of the man's mouth curved slightly, but there was no warmth to be felt. A few minutes later, the two chatted casually for a while before hanging up the phone. However, the call had not ended for long when the man's phone rang again. The next moment, the remaining warmth in the quiet pantry suddenly dissipated. "Boss, the opening is low. Do we need to sell?" The man stood up from the ground, pinched the drop of blood on his finger. The red immediately spread, contrasting with the man's cold expression, making people feel a sense of dread. "Are we trying to fake the line?" "Yes." As soon as the words fell, the man spoke again, his tone unusually cold. "I'll give you an address later. Sell that as soon as possible." "Yes." In the president's office, after hanging up the phone, Eloise looked at her phone screen, her eyebrows slightly furrowed as if she was pondering what had happened to Leonardo. Before she could call Jim, her quiet phone rang again with an incoming call. Eloise glanced at the screen. It was Patrick's call. At this moment, her mood was not very pleasant, and she was about to hang up the phone when something suddenly came to her mind, so she subconsciously pressed the answer button. As expected, the first sentence from the other end was, "Eloise, you're dating Jim's assistant." Unable to help cursing inwardly, Eloise's face instantly darkened. Indeed, it was that little rascal Patrick who caused the trouble. "Did you go to Align Corporation today?" Patrick seemed not to expect Eloise to suddenly ask this, his mind not reacting in time, and subconsciously replied, "The agent came to renew the contract with Jim, and he asked me to come along." Raising her hand to rub her aching temples, Eloise really wanted to swear at the moment, but years of upbringing did not allow her to do so. "So what did you say to Leonardo?" Patrick finally realized that the assistant, Leonardo, had reported to Eloise in advance. His heart was immediately filled with anger, and for a moment, he couldn't restrain his emotions and shouted at Eloise, "Is he even a man? How long has it been since I left, and he's already calling you?" Eloise's face darkened, feeling extremely displeased with Patrick's attitude. She knew that Patrick had an unusual affection for herself, and in her previous relationships, Patrick had not taken the opportunity to cause trouble. However, some of his methods were too low-level, so she didn't even want to pay attention to them, thus spoiling his unruly nature for a time. However, things were different this time. This was something she had worked hard for a long time, coaxing and persuading, and it was not something that Patrick could bully. "Patrick, have I been too lenient with you?" Eloise said, tapping her fingers rhythmically on the desk, as if this could somewhat alleviate the current irritability. "If this continues, the company may consider giving up on cultivating you. I'm not interested in having an unruly employee." Patrick, who was suddenly threatened on the other end, was dumbfounded, followed by a surge of grievance. "What did I do? It was clearly him who played the villain and reported to you first. You didn't see how arrogant he was just now." At this point, Eloise's fingers stopped tapping on the desk, as if she was doubting the truth of Patrick's words. Arrogant? She thought back to the scene when Leonardo spoke to her on the phone, his tone seemingly light, but filled with a hint of anxiety and caution. How could it be related to the word arrogant? Eloise subconsciously refuted, "I know his nature, you know my temper. If you bother him in the future, I can't guarantee that you can continue to stay in the circle." After saying this, without giving Patrick another chance to speak, Eloise directly hung up the phone and threw it onto the desk. The large office fell silent, and Eloise's ears echoed with Patrick's angry roar on the phone and the words Leonardo said not long ago. The two voices intertwined, causing Eloise's eyebrows to ache again. A faint doubt began to linger in her heart. On the other end, Patrick, who had the phone hung up on him, angrily kicked the trash can beside him, unable to help cursing lowly. He felt that Eloise was deceived. That guy is a green tea bitch, right? How can he play both sides of the fence? Eloise must have been bewitched. Bewitched by the facade of that male lover. He must expose his true colors. Otherwise, Eloise will be played around by him. Thus, holding the spirit of thinking for Eloise, Patrick began to secretly formulate plans, determined to poke through someone's disguise.